Greetings, men of 222. It's really great to be with you today. As you can tell, I'm in Arizona. The setting's a little different. I was going to do it outside, but I just didn't have the courage to do it. Hey, we're starting a new series today called Common Men, Uncommon Stories. And my goal is to explore the Bible for men who are like you and me, yet are used of God to accomplish amazing things. And our first character is Elijah the prophet. So what can we learn from Elijah? Referring to the manhood language, we can learn at least three major things from Elijah. His story tells us how the Israelites needed to judiciously choose between God and Baal, because not all choices are the correct choices or they're even good choices. And secondly, we can learn about what I call a mountaintop experience versus a valley experience. And then thirdly, we can learn about the fact that the best of us forgets from time to time to pray and to lean on God and to ask Him what He would have us do. Prayer is very critical, especially after a mountaintop experience. So who was Elijah? Well, he was a prophet of God. In fact, Elijah means Yahweh is God, and he lived around 850 BC. Elijah was a prophet who was chosen to speak to the northern and the southern tribes of Israel. And it is interesting to note that up until Elijah's time, the worst man who ever lived was King Omri, according to 1 Kings 16:25. Now, King Omri's son was Ahab, and you've heard that name, but he was Ahab. And Ahab became even more evil. In fact, it says in the Bible, Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all else who had been before him. And one of the problems was that Ahab was influenced by his wife Jezebel. The Bible says King Ahab was married to Jezebel, and the Bible paints this picture of her. It says, "Surely there was no one like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the sight of the Lord, because Jezebel, his wife, incited him." She was a Baal worshiper, follower, and he was supposed to be a worshiper and a follower of the one true God. But he was a really evil dude. How bad was Jezebel? Well, in Revelation, God says this. He says, "I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself prophetess, and that she teaches and leads my bondservants astray, so that they commit acts of immorality and eat things sacrificed to God." Now that Jezebel in Revelation isn't the Jezebel that was married to Ahab, but she depicts evil in such a way that God uses her name in the book of Revelation. And it was in this environment, imagine, all this evil, all these terrible people, that Elijah was to prophesy to Israel, led by King Ahab in the northern kingdom. So here you are, you're Elijah, and you're supposed to go and prophesy to this man that is the most evil man that ever lived. So what is the story? Well, we first meet Elijah in 1 Kings 17 when he gives this message to Ahab. He says, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall neither be dew nor rain these years, for 3 years, except by my word." 1 Kings 17:1. Now realize, this is the most evil guy that ever lived. Can you imagine how he'd feel about that message? In most of chapter 17, the Bible tells the story of God telling Elijah to go across the Jordan River, and that he's going to protect him and take care of him. That's right, that God is going to protect him and provide for him. And so while he is there, God had sent him to a brook, and he actually had ravens coming and feeding him, but the brook dried up. And so then God said, "Go to Zarephath." And when he did, Elijah met a widow who was preparing a meal that she and her son are going to eat and then basically lay down and die because there's no more food. Well, when Elijah finds that out, he says, look, God will provide. And God does by never letting the flour bowl go empty or letting the oil jar go dry. So Elijah witnesses God in action, keeping the flour bowl full, keeping the jar of oil full. He witnesses him in action. So when the widow's son dies, and he does, she berates Elijah and his God, and Elijah actually revives the son. So now Elijah has not only seen God keep the flour bowl full and the oil jar full, but now he has used Elijah to actually raise a man from the dead. So Elijah is an eyewitness to God providing and to raising the child. Imagine what that would do for your faith if God used you to raise someone for the dead. Wow. I don't know. It'd make me feel, unfortunately, probably pretty special. But it is in chapter 18 that we really see Elijah's greatest stand for God. As the 3 years come to a close, Elijah sees a man named Obadiah, who was Ahab's household manager. Elijah tells Obadiah to tell Ahab that Elijah wants to meet with him. Well, Elijah's scared to death because even though he is a disciple of Elijah and a believer in the one true God, Obadiah is concerned that if he goes to Ahab and says, Elijah wants to meet with you, that the Spirit will take Elijah somewhere else, and that Ahab will be mad at him and take him out. Well, Elijah assures Obadiah, no, I will show up. I will be there today. And oh, by the way, he says, bring 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. He says, bring all of these people that Jezebel and you are listening to and bring them to Mount Carmel. When Elijah meets Ahab and the prophets as well as the people from Israel, he challenges them and he says this, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? He's asking them, when are you going to choose? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people did not answer him with a word. 1 Kings 18 and 21. He tells them to judiciously choose between God and Baal. To help make up their mind, he sets up a challenge between himself and the 450 prophets of Baal. The challenge is to take 2 oxen, cut them up, and put them on the altar, one to God and one to Baal. But in both cases, they are not supposed to put fire under the altar. And the challenge is that they're to call on their God to light the fire and consume the sacrifice. Well, of course, Baal does not answer. And so in 1 Kings 18, 26 through 29, we read this. Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped about the altar which they had made. And it came at noon that Elijah mocked them. He said, call out with a loud voice, for he is God. Either he's occupied or he's gone aside, or maybe he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and he needs to be awakened. So they cried with a loud voice, and they cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances, and the blood gushed out of them. Well, when midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, but there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Well, Elijah invited the people then to gather around him, and he said, he built an altar, and he built a trench around the altar, and he arranged the wood, and he cut the ox, and he laid it on the wood, no fire underwards. And he said, fill 4 pitchers with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And then he said, that's not enough. Do it a second time. He said, that's not enough. He said, do it a third time, and they did it a third time. And the water flowed around the altar and filled the trench with water. Then Elijah prayed. Now here Elijah remembers to talk to God. And he says, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their back again and that you have turned their heart, back again. See, Elijah wasn't praying for himself. He was praying that God would get the credit. And then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water which was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." So once again, with a demonstration from God, people believed for that moment. Then Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook of the Kishon and slew them there. But look what happens next. Elijah doesn't pray. He's on a mountaintop experience. He's on a high of highs, what God has done. But in 1 Kings 19, we read this. Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and even more if I do not make you your life as the one of them by tomorrow about this time." So again, so may the gods do to me even more if I do not make your life as the life of one of them that is dead about this time. And he was afraid, watch this, and he was afraid and arose and he ran for his life. And he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. What happened? Mountaintop experience. Then all of a sudden the energy's gone and he kind of goes into a valley experience. And he's threatened by Jezebel. And what does he do then? He panics. He doesn't go to the God. He doesn't go to the God who has just in a magnificent way shown his power and his provision for Elijah, as he did for the widow of Zarephath when Elijah was with them. God had reacted and for him many, many, many times. What can we learn from that story? Well, we can learn a number of things. Elijah was a common man just like me and you. How do we know that? Because he had the same propensities that we do. Even though God had used him and he had magnificent success, he got scared. When he what? When he turned to his own power. When he turned away from God's provision and tried to find his own provision. Number two, Elijah was chosen by God to be God's instrument. And Elijah was happy with that. He was excited about that. Number three, Elijah had moments of great faith when he revived the child, when God provided for him, and on the mountaintop when he brought the fire down. Great faith. 4, Elijah knew there are moments in life where you must choose between God's way and the way of the world. Judiciously choose. What is it in your life right now that you know darn well you really need to choose a different way because that is God's way versus what's going on? Is it with your children? Is it with your wife? Is it something that's going on with you purposely? Personally? Here's my point. Choose God's way. That's what Elijah was saying. 5, when we have a mountaintop experience, when we have a great faith moment, when we're really close to God, we need to be very, very careful that we don't have a valley experience coming out of that. And how does that happen? We must fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, Hebrews 12:2. We should never give in to fear. We should talk to God to strengthen us through prayer. And lastly, we don't believe in faith for protection. We believe with faith for God's protection. John 4:4 says, "Greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world." We must never forget that. What a man. Common man. Uncommon story. Just like you and I can do. Hey, see you next Saturday, Lord willing, and the creeks don't rise. Be intentional this week as you honor Jesus.